Welcome to Artful Aging with Amy, where I ask caregivers and professionals the difficult questions that will give you guidance on your life's journey. Support is only one conversation away, and this is your first step. Let's go. Good morning, everyone. I'm Amy Friesen, and this is Artful Aging with Amy. Today, we're going to look at patient navigation and coordinating. I've been thrust right into the middle of it in my own personal life, and Margot and I are going to unhatch some of it so that hopefully other people can learn more about what patient navigation is, as well as maybe we can give some tips and tricks from our own experiences. Because let me tell you, making a move, even, we're trying to move my father-in-law, as many of you know, from one city to another. And even that is really, really difficult, especially when you need to capture all of the patient records and all this stuff. And we're just going to dive right into it. So Margot McWhirter is joining us today. She's a registered occupational therapist. You've seen her on before. We were talking about another piece last time, but this time we're going to really concentrate on patient navigation. Margot has a master's degree in gerontology, as many of you may remember. She has certificates in patient navigation, home modification, and universal and inclusive design. She is passionate about the connection between housing and healthcare and the impact both have on quality of life. Welcome back, Margot. Thanks for coming back and joining me today.
Great to be back and to have this important conversation, especially as you say, given the personal context that you're in right now.
I got to tell you, from a professional point of view, I handle it just like you. We deal with this stuff all the time. And so I have to say, I feel more prepared than the general public to deal with it. But when you're in it and you're feeling all of the feelings of crisis, you're feeling all of the feelings of, oh my goodness, what is tomorrow going to hold? It's a whole other level of stress and unorganization and things like that. So, Margot, could you please tell our audience a little more about you and your background so that they have a good understanding, and then we'll dive into things.
Hey, sure. Sounds great. Certainly you read my brief bio, and I think the other aspect that I would add to that information is really I have almost 30 years of clinical and non-clinical experience, really supporting people, which includes individuals, couples, and families living in the community or wherever it is that they choose to call home. And, I emphasize that because, it's so invaluable. It's not that people can't successfully, navigate the system without 30 years of experience, but because I've worked across the healthcare spectrum, and I like to say I know a little bit about a lot of things, and have very much kind of a problem-solving kind of brain, those both soft, but then also very hard or practical skills really help ground what I do in my business at Inclusive Aging.
Well, and the thing too is that, when our folks come to us, we do have this knowledge, and I have to say, I haven't come across a ton of patient navigators and coordinators. There's not a ton of us out there, I don't think, and it's difficult for people to locate us, and also why, we do the show, right? For people to find other people to help them. But, we do this every day, and I've talked to clients before to say, in my world for retirement homes, you have to almost become an expert in the subject matter that you're hopefully only going to be dealing with for this small set amount of time. And then you're going to go back to your life where you're a subject matter and all this other stuff. And so you're literally taking on a whole other job very quick and getting it done and then going back out of it. And it's that in itself is really stressful, just trying to learn everything you need to learn and not actually sure that you're learning the right stuff, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And I think the other thing to bear in mind, and this can be a challenge sometimes, just depending on personality or even circumstance. We always want to bring the best of ourselves and help our clients and families achieve the goals that they want. But part of that, and certainly an important part of understanding what patient navigation or even care coordination is, I like like it because it's very similar to occupational therapy. It's rather than doing things for people, it's doing things with. And so the idea of being, a co-pilot, sometimes, one of my colleagues likes to refer to, planning for aging in place as almost like planning for a trip. So that idea of being a tour guide, but my point being that as much as we do want to know everything, sometimes our, superpower or our secret strength is not knowing all of the answers or having all of the information ourselves, but knowing where to go and find that. And so even the example you gave around researching retirement residence, I'm going through that with a client and family right now. And especially because I'm based in Toronto, where the options are seemingly endless, I've actually subcontracted that out to an individual that almost exclusively is her whole business, just because, as you say, the amount of time and energy, mental as well as otherwise, to become an expert in that is quite daunting. And so again, it's that idea of, I don't know the answer, but I know how to go about finding it. And that might involve me ramping up and doing research and becoming the expert, or it might be actually saying, you know what, who do I know that can help me help my clients and family come up with the right information and navigate kind of that maze of options.
Well, and that's the thing, we're, as professionals, we're very connected to the community in general, right? And so we have probably looked for the answer before for other clients, or we know where to look, and it's so much faster, than someone just doing this I say on the side, but really it becomes a full-time job, but it's temporary, hopefully, right? And so when you're navigating, I want to kind of get into a little bit of defining, just so that people understand what we're talking about. But when you're navigating as a family member, that is the burden, even though everybody, most people would be like, it's not a burden, I'm happy to help. It is a burden though, because you're taking on this whole extra piece that you don't know anything about, which comes with added stress levels and chaos and all this stuff. And so, having people to really stand by you and help, and like you said, not do it for you, but just ride the ride with you, be there, and reach out if you need questions answered and things like that. So, Margot, let's look at, can you give us a bit of a definition around patient navigation, coordinating? I think that, let's just get everybody on the same page. I often find that families, like I said, don't really know these services are available to them, don't know where to look. And there's a lot of extra stress when it's your own family, and then everything in your life has to be kind of put on hold or moved around to accommodate. So let's start with definitions. Can you give us kind of an idea so everybody's on the same page?
For sure. I think, the idea of patient navigation, or definition of patient navigation, is really the skill set, if you will, of helping individuals and families basically navigate the often fragmented or siloed systems. So that can be healthcare, that can be social services, that may be, seniors housing options, in a way that essentially allows them to access the services that they need for their health, for their, mental health, for their quality of life, and also as a way of supporting caregivers, because that's a huge part of it. But where I like to distinguish, patient navigation potentially from other roles within the healthcare system, is that the focus is on the patient. What are their goals? What are their wishes? And can we agree, or as a patient navigator, often I'm guiding a conversation to help the client and family establish what their goals of care are, so that we then have a bit of a roadmap or a working plan to say, okay, what are we doing about housing? What are we doing about care? What are we doing about transportation? What are we doing about meals? What are we doing about, some of the legal or the financial aspects of it? all with the idea of navigating, getting individuals sort of into that safe harbor or that port, if you will, for whatever that phase might be in their healthcare or in their aging journey. And so it sounds maybe a little bit esoteric, if I can call it that, but really unlike some other roles in the healthcare system where it's about, the system is designed to work efficiently and effectively and get people through in a way that I don't want to say benefits the system because that sounds more negative or pessimistic than I intend to. But if we aren't focused on the patient, then the patient can often get lost in that fragmented and siloed system. So that's really a huge part of what a patient navigator / elder care coordinator is going to be involved in. And that's not to say, at least in my, perspective, that I work separately or in opposition to some publicly funded services or other people who may have similar adjacent roles, across those systems that I mentioned. But rather, I'm there, as you pointed out, kind of as a resource, as a reference for the family or the individual to come back and say, okay, we're trying to navigate this now. Can you help us understand, because we're running into roadblocks or barriers? And so again, it's often that kind of advocacy, the kind of overcoming roadblocks, so strategizing, just even presenting some different alternatives, because especially when people are feeling like they are in a crisis, and then also trying to make decisions potentially under stress. I can say this personally myself, right? That's not the time where you kind of start, really opening your mind and saying, what are all my options? Really, the intent, often the default is to start to kind of isolate and bring, narrow down your decisions and maybe not see some of the options that are available, either because you just don't know, because how would you know unless you're working with somebody like a care coordinator or patient navigator, or you're just so overwhelmed that you're just like, I can't kind of do anything more. So again, that's also where a patient navigator can be so instrumental. And I would say that's all of that role can often feel rather high level. And then, you mentioned about the idea of care coordination. I often talk to my clients and families about, sort of two sides of the same coin, because in some cases, people just need a bit of direction and some information, and they can run with that. And in other cases, for whatever reason, it may be language, it may be cognitive ability, it may be, health and lack of other social supports. Individuals actually need help to implement that plan or to basically take that next step. And that's where the care coordination piece can really come into play. And, again, part of the conversation I have with clients and families is, for example, I don't have a roster of care staff, personal support workers, etc. So it's not like I'm an agency and coordinating that, but I can be a liaison between, the individual or family and the caregivers. Similarly, part of what I do, and this is probably more so now again on the patient navigation side, is I do have some clients who just easily get overwhelmed, or they may have issues with their memory. And so when they have a medical appointment, they actually want me to accompany them to take notes and to basically be a repository of information. Also asking questions that they may not know or be aware of to ask when we're sitting with the doctor or other healthcare professional, in order to make sure that, once we've left the doctor's office, that there is a record of what was discussed. But then also, and this is sort of where the patient education piece comes into it, and kind of strategizing with clients and families to say, okay, so now that we know this, and it may be, diagnostic specific, it may be sort of course of treatment, what are the options? how are we going to analyze and interpret that information? And then again, keeping the individual hopefully in the driver's seat and saying, I'd like to go this way, not that way. And that's part of the sort of conversation, both in terms of the listening of what is said and not said, but then also creating a conversation around what's possible, or maybe some decisions that need to be made either in the short term or, on the next, 6 to 12 month horizon.
Yeah, absolutely. I find that as people in our roles, specifically as navigators, coordinators, or whatnot, because like you said, the system is very process focused, very siloed. And I'll tell you a bit about what happened to us recently, but very siloed. And so as coordinators, because we're people focused and we know the questions because of our experience, we're able to draw out information that people don't think about. I often tell my coach, if you want to know about something, don't expect me to just volunteer the information. If you ask me a question, I'll answer it because then I'll think about all that stuff. Yeah. But I won't think about to tell you because I'm not in that process. And so often, Margot, we just folks like us, we drag that information out, we qualify it, we organize it. And because we're working with a person, like for instance, when we go into retirement living, often the person at the retirement home only meets that person when they come for a tour. But there's, 75% of the process before where we've done all this work trying to figure out what's the best process for them, what's going to fit better, do they need that? Do they need this? What's their long-term goals? All of that stuff. And so we're very focused on making sure that they, as a person, ask, the questions that are pertinent to their situation and that they get what they need. And then we bridge the gap to the silos and the process of it, really. And so, of course, my doorbell rings as we're doing this, as happens. But so I guess, giving you an idea of what happened with us recently, and it's happened to many of our clients. We have my father-in-law moving in, which is something that my viewers know, and we're in the process. And we went to pick him up near Windsor, and we got there, and then we proceeded to sit in ER for 13 hours because we, although had a plan, which, all of my guests and myself are very pro-plan, still pro-plan, but it doesn't always work the way that you want it to work. And luckily, I was thinking about that during this time. And it's like, luckily I did have a plan because although I had to change it, I wasn't starting from zero. And I think that's valuable to not have to feel like you're, have to start over, everything's out. And so we then needed to change what we were doing. And consequently, my husband is actually still there with his dad. We're just sorting it all out. And I'm sorting things out I can do long distance. He's sorting things out he can do there. And something that, really struck me is, as we're sitting in ER, it didn't even look that busy, right? Like I've been in ERs multiple times and it just, it was pretty mellow. It's a small town. It just took so long. And no matter what we did, we just couldn't get him to a point of getting in sooner. We had, he's very frail. So we had lots of blankets and all sorts of stuff. And we just kept going back saying, things are really going downhill. Can you please get us in now? And we just couldn't push it along fast enough. And, I understand the process, right? Like I understand what's happening, but then that's the difference between being process focused and people focused and really understanding what's happening out there. And then, he had got an x-ray 2 days ago at the very same hospital to which the ER doctor could not get his hands on for some reason. And so then we had to follow that. And he's got about, 5-6 specialists. And so Mike's there trying to put everything together and picking up records, and they won't transfer them to Ottawa. And it's craziness. And I'm guessing, you've seen this probably before, right? And it's like, how do people wrap their head around the steps and, what do I do and how do I get these records from one to another? And, if I move, is someone going to drop the ball and then I lose a specialist and can't they refer? And what about my prescriptions? And there's a lot out there, Margot.
There's so much to consider. And I think especially for us, I mean, you've described a very challenging and stressful situation with your father-in-law. So I sincerely hope for everybody's sake that things, work out well. When we're working with older adults in particular and families, we also are navigating their life experience as well as, skills and limitations and expectations. So, when you talk about, basically being there and almost being the quarterback, and saying, okay, now we need to do this. How do we, deal with, what this issue? Hey, have you remembered that there is an older gentleman sitting under several blankets here and we've been waiting an extended period of time? I often say to other people within the system and kind of silos, let me help you and my client at the same time by managing expectations, because in some cases, what people need to hear is that as, frustrating or aggravating or whatnot a situation may be, it's not entirely outside the realm of normal. And I mean, I regret to say that, but that is the healthcare system that we live in. But then on the flip side, we, especially where we get to know our clients very well, there's been numerous examples, and I'm a registered occupational therapist. I'm not a nurse, but I've actually flagged clients to the healthcare system, in this case, like a home care system, to say, this client is not doing as well clinically. And, it's not that they didn't have nursing care in there, but if nursing was focused on, one thing, maybe it was wound care, or maybe it was, managing urinary tubes or something. Sometimes they don't kind of take that bigger step back and look at the big picture. And so then to raise that flag and say, hey, we have a different issue now. And I'm thinking specifically of a client who I recognized was very rapidly deteriorating and becoming palliative. And fortunately, the publicly funded system did kick in and we got, supports and services. So in his case, his preference was to pass away at home. But that took my role and having worked with him and known him for over 2 years to say, he's been frail and vulnerable and having, challenges, medical and otherwise, for all of this time. But this is something different. And so, as you were speaking, I think one of the things that occurred to me, and again, it can happen whether you're at ER, whether our clients are encountering other professionals, maybe meeting a specialist, etc. But one of the things that can be both most challenging, but also most rewarding in the kind of work that we do is getting to know our clients and families as people. And I do kind of caution that takes time, right? We have ourselves a process, intake and assessment and questions, but I'm not going to be able to learn all of the little nuances that can help me be the best navigator and advocate and liaison for my clients until I get to know them. And so then that requires, a level of trust and information sharing and answering questions, and perhaps that exchange of information in a way that respects professional boundaries, etc. But really, we do become to a greater extent than I think many people would imagine, really intimately involved in individuals' lives. And so that, again, as I say, that's a challenge, but it's also very rewarding.
So, I mean, the thing is about, I found that a lot of people tend to also think that the medical system will do X, or they assume that they'll do something. And so, again, I'm a professional, but this is also my family that I'm dealing with right now. And I'm always careful. And I think so many of us are professionals that deal with it in our families as well, that, I'm always careful to say, to my husband, like, here's my advice. I'm not trying to step on your toes. Please let me know if it's too pushy or whatever, because there's a fine boundary with families as well. Right. And it's like, but what was interesting is that when they got into the back of the ER, so where the beds are, and I was sitting out in the waiting room for 3 hours till we gave up and I went home, and they stayed there because there was no use of me sitting there anyway. I was actually texting Mike while he was in there, ask the doctor this, do this. And, he said, oh, well, I assumed that they would do that. I'm like, don't assume anything. Ask everything, because unless you ask, it may or may not be done. And you don't even know if they've considered it. And, you'd hope that things were done, but more often than not, if you don't ask, that either the person's not thinking about that, like maybe it's something for medical purposes, maybe they thought it was something and they're looking into that realm. But like you said, often there's a whole spectrum of things going on. And so unless you say, hey, we're specifically concerned about this, could we do X? You may not get the answer you want. And so I think it's so valuable to be able to be connected to patient navigators and coordinators so that somebody else who is not in crisis with you, but has your best interests in mind, can think about, okay, what's going on? I know the situation, what's happening, how does the medical system work? For me, how do the retirement homes work, and how does working with the hospital and retirement homes work together? What is that system? Okay, where do we fit in that system, and what do I need to ask to make sure my client is taken care of properly? And so, that's the other thing. It's like you just don't know what you don't know. And unless you literally ask everything, you may not actually get the answers, and you may not know you don't have the answers until you're in this awkward position of needing that answer that you don't have anymore.
Yeah. And also being able to provide the right answers or information from your client's perspective, or in this case, your father-in-law's perspective, to give the healthcare system the information they need in order to help him. Like, I'm thinking of an example where I sat for many hours in an emergency room pre-COVID with a client, and they were getting ready. I could tell, it was like 11:30 at night or something, and they were getting ready to basically make their final decision whether to admit or discharge her. And they started asking, a series of questions. And, this client was physically frail, but cognitively very well. But she had been lying in ER 4 hours, like 10 hours maybe, without anything to eat and very little to drink. And they wanted to see if she could get up and walk. And I said, hang on a second. This is an older adult who has had nothing to eat for 12 hours. She is not going to be strong. And so let me go to the cafeteria, get her some juice, get her something to eat, and then come back and do your assessment. And, that's just a small example. And that certainly is not something from a service perspective that I do a lot. Like, I don't tend to spend a lot of time in emergency rooms with my clients, but that alone is an example of where, particularly for older adults, if you don't have family, or you don't have, you basically, you should never go to hospital alone is the short answer. And I'm not dissing hospitals. I'm not saying they're, not good places, but to your point, right? You need somebody who can ask the right questions, who can hear the responses with a different ear than potentially the general public. And then the other huge piece that a patient navigator or care coordinator can really help with is then the successful implementation or the after effect. Because again, if people are seen in emerge, or they're in hospital or in rehab, and then there's a discharge to home, but those are two different systems that don't necessarily coordinate well between them, other than filing the referral, then that's where people can fall through the gaps. And again, it's not dissimilar when I'm thinking about like home safety assessments or home modifications. I'm looking for the potential risks and hazards where people are going to run into difficulty, where they're going to run into barriers to accomplishing their goals and basically staying safe and healthy. And I'm saying, hang on a sec, this is an issue that we need to address.
For sure. And it's funny that you mentioned the ER with your client there, because one of the things that I really noticed while I was there is that, this almost the same thing, right? We were there for 13 hours. There was a whole crew of us. I was entertaining the whole ER that night. And I traveled with juice boxes. So it's like I was traveling. I had, snacks. I had random cashews and stuff. And I was offering them because honestly, people were there. There was almost sets of groups of people that all of us came in together. We all spent this time and then we all disbanded. Right. And, there was a gentleman there that was probably around my age, and he literally could not move. He was almost he just was so sore, and there was something going on, and they were doing CAT scans and stuff, and they had him up 5 times at least. And I kept saying every time he came up, would you like a wheelchair? Make it easier on yourself, right? And no, none of the nursing staff, nothing, nobody paid attention. And then there's small kids that, don't functionally understand what's happening. There were seniors. It was just a whole schmammet of everything. And like you said, there's no food in sight, right? And so I got thinking there as I was spending all my time in ER, it's why don't they have something up here? Why don't they have something if it's going to take this long, right? And so that was just an interesting observation I had that is very similar along your lines too.
And I think it goes back to something that you said before about, advising Mike, your husband, that, not to assume or have lofty expectations about the medical system. And, again, all due respect and credit to emergency departments, they are there dealing with people in the midst of medical crisis. Hydration and nutrition and some of those other adjacent considerations, but that's not their primary focus. And so, I'm not suggesting for a moment that the idea of having a small commissary or something, in a retirement residence or a long-term care home, they bring around a cart with snacks and whatever. That would be probably a great thing to have within the emergency department. But again, that's where that takes bigger picture thinking, because that's not, you and I both know that that's critical to people's health and wellness, but in a critical medical crisis situation where they're dealing with, people who've been involved in car accidents and having heart attacks or stroke or whatever, thinking about, hey, how long has it been since you've had a meal? That's not really going to be top of mind. So good on you for A, having that on hand, and then B, offering to assist others.
Tell you, Margot, someday you and I, we're going to rule the world and everybody will have food and juice.
Everybody. Yeah. And there are, there's some research and some studies and some information out there about designing elder-friendly emergency departments. And oftentimes that comes from the perspective of, working with people who may have cognitive issues. But, similarly, imagine if you mentioned that there's, intergenerational people who are at an emergency department. Imagine that it was a young adult with autism who was coming in with a broken leg, and just all of the sensations of being overwhelmed. Not to whatever, talk about customer experience, but really that's a bit of what we're talking about here. When we, look at the situation from the individual and the family's perspective, that changes things significantly.
Yeah, I agree. Margot, thanks for joining us today. Can you tell everyone your contact information if they want to get a hold of you? Again, you're in the Toronto area, so maybe, generally speaking, people just kind of have to go on the internet to find us, right? Generally speaking. But so could you let us know how to get a hold of you? And then do you have any advice for people that maybe aren't in our area to have how they can find someone like yourself or someone like myself? Do you have any thoughts to that?
Okay. So I'll just direct people to my website. So it's www.inclusive aging.com. And then there's a contact form for either sending me an email or getting in touch with me. Be happy to speak with anybody. And with respect to, how to locate individual private patient navigators, oftentimes for me, it is word of mouth. So if wherever people are at, if they know of other, if they have family or friends, they could ask that way. In some cases, people are taking to Facebook and within community chats or, Nextdoor app, lots of different kind of social media way. There are I should say that I'm not aware that there is this kind of registry of, patient navigators. But having said that, I know you and I know some individuals in the Maritimes and people out west. So we almost find each other so that if people come to us, like, for example, I may have family members who contact me that they live in the Toronto area, but their parent is in British Columbia or in Nova Scotia or something. And so then I can maybe redirect them. But, it is a challenge. I'm not sure that I have any more concrete suggestions than that.
Well, and for sure, that for myself, I have connected with, people across Canada that do what I do because there's like 12 of us. There's very few of us, right? And so sometimes, like, if you find one of us, we most likely will have a contact. So I always welcome people to reach out to me. I'm sure that you wouldn't mind us either, just for some direction, right? Because we're wanting to help people. And so I'm happy to email connect people if they need it. So Margot, thanks again for joining us today. I really appreciate all of your insight, and I hope that we will have you back on in the due time in the next little bit.
That'd be great. And certainly all the best once again to you and your family. And thanks for having me on your show.
Thank you. And there you have it for today's show. If you've enjoyed what we've been talking about, if you have found value, please share it with your networks, like us on YouTube or the podcast that you're listening to us on. Thanks again for joining me on Artful Aging with Amy. And for me, to all of you, I hope that you have a wonderful Wednesday.